The thing about Asperger syndrome or high-functioning autism is that it's usually easy to tell people what it's all about. But explaining what it is and communicating so that they understand what it is are two entirely different things. For example, let's say somebody came back from this is a terrible example, but it just came to my mind. So you got a time machine, you bring somebody back from 200 years ago. Okay? And these people, they're used to riding horses and buggies. And they point to that thing in your garage and they say, "What is that?" And you say, "That is a car. It takes the place of a horse and buggy." Okay, well, they've got a level of understanding, right? They have knowledge, I should say, but they don't have understanding. So when it comes to Asperger syndrome, autism, a lot of people have knowledge, but they don't have understanding. They don't really understand what you're talking about. So how do you take them from that level of knowledge of knowing, for example, number one is we have difficulty interacting socially. We have what is called social anxiety. It's easy to say social anxiety. Okay, now we know you've got social anxiety, but you don't understand. Someone may not understand what it is. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we move people from knowledge to understanding when it comes to Asperger syndrome? Well, the way to do that is you have to find a point of reference that they understand. And then you associate what we are experiencing, social anxiety, with what they have experienced, and that will help them understand it. Okay, social anxiety, the classic example that I've used time and time and time again, you may have heard me say this, but if you have a friend who doesn't quite understand social anxiety, they may think they do, but they really don't. The way to get them to understand it is to ask them if they like to give public speeches. Now, most people don't, because when you give a speech publicly, remember when you were a kid, you had to give an oral report in school, whatever. They get real nervous. I mean, these are people who can socialize easy among a crowd of hundreds. They just mix right in. But you take that same person in front of that same crowd of hundreds of people, and they just freeze up. Why? I mean, it's the same people. You just talk to them. But now you're talking to them en masse, and for some reason, that triggers anxiety. They become nervous and scared. They can't speak. The words don't come out. And if you associate, that's the same thing we experience, only not when speaking publicly, but when speaking individually with other individuals. So now they have this grasp, they have an understanding of what that is all about. Well, what about this thing that we call social cues? Somebody said one time that about 70% of human communication is not verbal, but it is nonverbal. It is through body language, facial expressions. How does a dog communicate? Well, they perk up their ears, they raise their tail, or they duck their tail, and those are nonverbal communications. They say something. The dog may not be barking, but if he ducks his tail, he's afraid. If he perks up his ears, he's listening. He may be friendly. And so you see all these nonverbal cues in critters of all kinds, and humans are no different. Now, we may be more verbal than others, but because we can talk, But we still have nonverbal cues. About 70%, again, of our communication is nonverbal. Now, that was a nonverbal cue that said, "A bug just flew in my eye." You might want to remember that. So we could take the example of a dog. And a dog growls at you, and okay, that's not a good sign. And sometimes people will, not literally, but figuratively speaking, they will growl at you, and you will say, "Okay, those aren't words, but I can tell this person is not happy." Or somebody may flip you off, right? That's a nonverbal sign. That's a hand signal. This person is probably upset about something. But maybe not. Maybe it's a friend and they're just playing around with you. Do you know the difference? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But how I like to explain this to people who don't quite understand, they have knowledge but not understanding, is, there are some languages, including English, but particularly the Chinese language, Mandarin, where some of the words have different meanings based upon the way that you say them. I mean, the word is pronounced exactly the same, but there is a different inflection, like an accent that's put on part of the word that totally, completely, 100% changes the meaning. Just totally. And if you don't know the inflections, you have no idea what they're saying. But when it comes to social cues, it's like a foreign language that we don't know, but add on top of that the inflections that we don't know. Mind blindness, we talk about that a lot on this channel. So we're with a group of people and we just somehow don't fit in because we don't speak that language. The language that we don't speak is nonverbal language. We just don't get it. I mean, we've picked up a few words, like flipping people off. Yeah, okay, we got that one. Somebody growls at us and they get mad, stomp, and throws things or whatever. That's a pretty good cue that's hard to miss. Okay. Those outlier terms, nonverbal terms, we can come to terms with. We understand those, but that's about it. Beyond that, we just don't understand. Number 3 is obsession. How do you explain to people the fact that those of us with Asperger syndrome, with high-functioning autism, get obsessed over things? Well, again, what you do is you see if they have a point of reference. Is there anything that they have ever been obsessed over? Probably so. I think everyone has some point in their life, some kind of an obsession. Maybe the first time they struck up a love relationship, or maybe the second, third time. They were obsessed with this person with whom they deemed themselves to be in love with. They were obsessed. Another good example that I think may work with some people, maybe not, but particularly those of us who are older, is if you can remind them what it was like in 1963 when the Beatles showed up in the United States. And virtually every girl who was, young teenager, pre-adolescent girl became obsessed with the Beatles. And there were some exceptions, but most every girl I knew thought the Beatles were the greatest thing ever. And they became obsessed with these 4 guys from Liverpool. They knew their names. They knew how old they were. They knew where they were raised. They knew more about their backgrounds than they knew about themselves. Some of them, they knew more about the Beatles than they knew about their friends. They were just obsessed with that group. Well, that obsession obviously wore off as the girls grew older. But using those types of illustrations may help people move from a knowledge of obsession to understanding what obsession really is. And those of us with Asperger syndrome, we become obsessed with things where we have to know everything about whatever that thing happens to be. Just like a pre-adolescent girl being obsessed with the Beatles in 1963, 1964. Number 4, what about hyperfocus? How do you explain that to a person who does not have Asperger syndrome? So you say, sometimes we have hyperfocus. Say, well, yeah, I know what that is. I know what hyper means. I know what focus means. So, yeah, I understand it, but they don't understand it. They just know what the words mean. So how do you take them from knowing to understanding? Well, here's what I do. You might want to try this. And I ask them, have you ever just totally blocked something out? That you were so focused on something you couldn't think about anything else? Maybe you had an emergency. Maybe you had a loved one who needed to get to the hospital immediately, and you just had to get them in the car, get them to the hospital, and suddenly you are a law-abiding citizen, but suddenly the speed limits, it's as if they were on stoplights, those were optional. It was a do-or-die situation. So you became hyper-focused on getting this person to the hospital. Or somebody may just be injured and you didn't rush them to the hospital, but you had to treat their injuries. Maybe it was you. And suddenly everything else didn't matter as much as treating that injury, because if you didn't treat it, it could be permanent, or maybe you could bleed to death. I don't know. But those are some examples. But the one that I use the most is I ask people, have you ever flown into a blind rage? Most people have done that. They may not admit it, but most people have, where you become so angry you stop thinking. And your mind is singularly focused on expressing your outrage. and you go to pieces. Hopefully you don't do it in public, but you just go crazy. So it seems because you are hyper-focused. So when you take people who are not autistic and they know what hyper-focus is, they don't really understand it, you may want to ask them, have you ever flown into a blind rage and you were hyper-focused on throwing a hissy fit? Now maybe they understand what it's all about, only hyper-focus is not rage, obviously. It just simply means that we block out everything, kind of like when you're in a rage. We just block everything out and we're singularly focused on this, and we may not even hear what other people are saying. We are so focused. Number 5 is sensitivities, or you may say hypersensitivities, not the same as hyperfocus. But sensitivity, some people are very sensitive to glowing lights or flickering lights. I've been in places where the lights were maybe not intense, but to me they were, where I just had to close my eyes. It's the only way I could deal with them. You know, I was in a church like that once, and the lights, I don't know what it was about those lights, but they were so annoying that I had to close my eyes, and I think the preacher thought I was sleeping through a sermon. I wasn't. I just couldn't open my eyes because it just drove me crazy. It gave me a migraine, you know? So you have these problems, and sometimes it's with sound, sometimes it's with fabric. My sensitivities are fabric in particular because some clothing just, that little tag they used to put on the back of t-shirts drive you nuts, things like that. My hypersensitivity that no one else seems to have is getting a haircut. They have these little clippings fall on your shoulders. That drives me absolutely insane. I've never met anyone else that has the same sensitivity, but they're there, and we all have them, those of us with Asperger syndrome. But I say we all have them. Actually, we all do have them. For example, and this is how you relate to a person who does not have autism, is you may suggest to them to remember when they were in school, when they had chalkboards. I think maybe they still do, I don't know. And the teacher would scrape his or her, usually it was her, scrape her fingernails on the chalkboard. And all the students in unison would go crazy. Now, I don't know why teachers don't do that more often. If your kids are misbehaving and you need to get attention of the class, just take your fingernails and rub them, scrape them across the chalkboard, and you immediately quiet down your class. You might want to try that sometime. You can thank me later, but that's just a suggestion. But sensitivities, there are things that everyone is sensitive to. But people with Asperger syndrome, we tend to be more sensitive to more things. And to relate to people, what that means going from knowledge to understanding is just to relate some of the things that they experience, in their everyday life that to which they are sensitive. And then they'll get it. Or if they're thinking people, I should say, they will get it. See those 2 rectangles on the screen? Let's keep on talking if you want. All you got to do is click one of those 2 rectangles and the conversation goes on. But if not, thank you for stopping by, and we will see you all next time.